Ah, and where did you put it? Over in that
the
same...
outdoor proof
Ah, yes. It's the largest proof box in the United States of America. Jiggle, jiggle, jiggle. It's gonna need more time. If you're a sandwich lover like me, you know that they are only as good as the bread that they are built on, which is why I wanted to devote an entire episode of Bake It Up a Notch specifically to buns and rolls for sandwiches. In this episode, we are gonna be making 3 delicious roll recipes: my mini ciabatta or ciabattina rolls, these delicious, soft, pillowy, fluffy, buttery buns, and we're also going to be making some crusty hoagie rolls. These are warm out of the oven right now and they smell incredible. But I also have to give an honorable mention to a roll that we've already covered in the past, which are my pretzel rolls. We talked about these in the pretzel episode, but no sandwich episode would be complete without them. So they're gonna make a little appearance in this episode too. It's gonna be a lot of fun, so let's get baking. In pastry school, we learn about all of the steps of the bread baking process, and famously, there are 12. And while all of these steps are important, and you know I love to do things the precise way, I think that they can make the bread baking process sound more daunting than it is, especially when so many recipes at their core, including some of the recipes in this episode, are really so simple. A lot of bread recipes contain relatively few ingredients, and they are often ingredients that you already have in your pantry. And while they do take a lot of time, it's a lot of hands-off downtime. And I think that makes the bread baking process perfect for a lazy weekend afternoon or a snow day or even working from home, because a lot of the steps only take 5 to 10 minutes and then rest for a long time. So you can sort of do it while you're doing other things. That's why I prefer to think of it as the rhythm of bread baking. Yes! Nailed it. Don't care what they say. The first part of this rhythm is the mixing process. And while every bread can have a slightly different mixing method, the ones in this episode are pretty much just combining all of the ingredients into a mixer to make a smooth, uniform dough. The next part is the first rise, or this is often considered the bulk fermentation. This is very hands-off, of course. This is when the entire dough you just mixed rises together. It helps the dough gain flavor and stability. The next part of the rhythm is a little bit more hands-on. It's the dividing and sometimes something called pre-shaping. This is when you take the larger amount of dough that you just bulk fermented and you divide it into whatever size the loaves or rolls, in our case of today's episode, are going to be. After dividing and pre-shaping, then you're actually going to shape your final loaf, or today, lots of delicious rolls. Next is the final fermentation, or final rise and proof. This is when the shaped dough is going to rise before you bake it. So for our rolls, we're gonna do some proof tests. We're gonna look for them to be noticeably puffy and larger in size. Finally, the bread is baked. This is the part that's going to make your kitchen smell so good, and I can't wait to get started. So let's start rolling on our first roll. Two of the rolls we're gonna make today are a really good, simple introduction to the concept of preferments. We've talked about those before on Bake It Up a Notch in our Understanding Yeast episode, but this is a really good review. One of the most popular and commonly known types of preferments is sourdough, but there are several varieties of preferments that are really simple and require a lot less time and advanced preparation to make, but they can still contribute the same benefits to your dough, including flavor, structure, and a nice, good overall texture when you bake the bread. In the case of this biga that we're going to make for our ciabatta rolls, you're going to want to mix it 12 hours before you want to mix your final dough. To mix the biga, we're just going to combine some bread flour, a small amount of instant yeast, and some water, and mix it for a short period of time until it sort of forms a shaggy mass. The idea here is that there's a small amount of yeast which will jumpstart the fermentation, giving this biga a little bit of flavor, but it's also going to give us so much structure. Preferments are really commonly used for crusty breads and loaves. So sometimes if you've tried to make something like that at home and it hasn't turned out the same as what you get from a bakery, This is why. The pre-ferment really makes a difference. So it's well worth that extra little bit of effort and advanced planning. But really, we just made the biga. In just a few seconds here, it's already done. I'm gonna cover this, let it sit for 12 hours, and then it'll be ready to add into our dough. If your ambient room temperature is higher than 75 degrees Fahrenheit, you're gonna wanna let it sit at room temperature for 6 hours and then refrigerate it for the remaining 6 hours, just so that dough doesn't go all crazy on you at that warmer temperature. Ciabatta dough actually gets mixed by hand. So when your biga has had its nice 12 hours, it's gonna look really nice and jiggly like this. We love to see it. And you can see all the bubbles on the surface, which shows the activity and the fermentation of the yeast. That's where we're gonna get some of that extra flavor into this dough. So when we're ready to mix the dough, the first thing we wanna do is start with our flour in a bowl, and we wanna add our other ingredients, the salt and the yeast, just to mix those dry ingredients so they're uniformly combined before we get started. Typically, when you're mixing bread, you kind of just toss everything in and mix it to form a smooth dough. This is one of those slight extra steps that actually is worth it, only so that we make sure we have even distribution of the salt and the yeast before we start to hydrate it with the water and the biga. And this dough is going to start by being a little bit difficult to mix. It's really important that you scrape through there and make sure that there's no unhydrated portions of flour. And it's also going to start to look a little bit soupy. Please do not fear. That is how this is supposed to look. This is a highly hydrated dough. And this is amazing because it actually makes the dough super crunchy and crispy on the outside. And it means that the internal crumb structure is really light and airy and full of bubbles. It's a perfect sandwich roll. When you're mixing a dough by hand, it's really important to think about those visual cues that the recipe gives you. And I always tell people that one of the first ways you know it's kind of starting to form that dough is when it starts to form a ball around the spatula, and that's already happening. We still need to make sure we're scraping really well because it can be deceptive. Like, look, here are some underhydrated bits, dry flour that we really need to incorporate. So we need to keep scraping as we're doing it, but that sign that it's forming a ball around the spatula is showing that the hydration has started to be distributed evenly throughout. And even though I don't normally hold a spatula in a bowl like this, sometimes when I'm mixing a bread dough by hand, I really do it like this, kind of vertical, straight, or straight up and down, because it allows you to really see then when that ball shape sort of starts to form. Then after you kind of reach that first visual cue, you're just gonna keep mixing it for several minutes. The recipe says 4 to 5. The idea is you wanna form a smooth dough and build some structure. Now again, this is something you can do in a mixer as well, and it would only take a few minutes, but I always think it's so great to make bread by hand, and this recipe really lends itself well to it because it isn't as firm of a dough. It doesn't really require kneading. It really more requires some stirring. Okay, this is looking really good. I'm just gonna go ahead and cover this and let it rise for 1 hour until it is visibly bubbly on the surface, and it will almost double in size. Ooh, as you can see, our ciabatta dough is really done a lot of proofing. In fact, this is one of my favorite ways that you can tell if something is double in size, is to literally use a bowl that is about twice the size of the dough when you first put it in. Now, one of your friends, when you're dealing with a dough this sticky, later it's going to be flour, but right now it's something like oil or non-stick spray. We don't want to use wet hands because it could only make the dough more wet. We're already dealing with a very wet, sticky dough. But as you can see, even this wrap, it has risen to the level of the wrap. So I have a plastic dough scraper, and I'm just going to use it. It's been lightly greased, and I can just use that to help scrape off anywhere that it is touching the surface there. What we're gonna do now is we're gonna fold the dough. What this does is kind of mid-fermentation allows the dough additional chance to build structure. And in the case of a highly hydrated dough like this, it's actually going to make it easier to handle when we go to shape it later. What we're going to do is we're going to put the rounded side down into the bowl, kind of trying to get underneath it, bringing the dough up and onto itself, and this is the action of folding. I'm gonna now go to the next kind of area, bring it up and over. We're gonna go all the way around the bowl, doing this 3 to 5 times, or even more if for some reason you can't get kind of underneath all the way, because as you start to do it, obviously the dough deflates, and it becomes a little bit easier like that. See, I can just go underneath, bring it up. Lean doughs like this one often benefit from really long rise times. Again, this is both for flavor and structure. So this is ready to rise. Again, it's going to rise for an hour to an hour and 15 minutes until it puffs up to this level one more time. Okay, our ciabatta has once again risen to the top here. So we'll just give it a scrape to release, and we're going to shape it. Now, the word ciabatta in Italian is literally translated to slipper. So that can sometimes confuse people because they look at this jiggly dough. Look at this. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. That brings me great joy. Oh, so jiggly. It's very difficult to shape that. Can you imagine trying to make that into like a baguette shape? Can you imagine trying to make that into like a perfectly round roll? So no, that's not what we do. We shape this. It's sort of a like, let the dough fall where it may. And it is sort of a flatter roll. And that's what that slipper really means. It sort of resembles, very roughly, a shoe. So for a full loaf of ciabatta, you would have kind of a long piece of dough. In this case, we want to cut like little squares or rectangles so that they are all individual little ciabatta rolls. So in order to manipulate this very jiggly dough, we're going to use a sifter to really generously coat our work surface with flour. I had one person on Instagram say she was not kidding when she said to be generous. It's like, we don't use the word generous lightly in baking. When we say generous, I like pretty much only use it for this ciabatta recipe and whipped cream. Generous, be generous. Let's empty this onto the work surface, or pour is perhaps more accurate. Wasn't it? Now what we need to do is we need to sort of even out this shape. I want it to look a little bit more like a square. So I can go ahead and start by sifting it a little bit just to make that a little bit easier on myself. And I really want to handle it as minimally as possible. I'm just going to kind of reach into the center here and grab some of that. You can also kind of use your fingertips the way you would on a focaccia to help kind of just bring it out into that more square shape. It doesn't need to be perfect. This is all I was trying to do. Even it out a little bit in thickness and achieve a slightly more square shape, okay? One more little flour dust. Now we are going to evenly divide this into 8 even pieces. Now, right now, they look a little bit more like rectangles than like the squares I want them to be. So let me show you how we rectify that. As I put it onto the baking sheet, I am going to take the piece of dough and I'm just going to almost fold it under itself a little bit. This is so sticky and soft. Don't be afraid to just use your bench scraper to help you. But we just kind of want to squish it into more of that square shape. So again, as you put it down, just squish it a little bit into that square shape. I'm going to cover our beautiful ciabatta rolls with some nice clean kitchen towels and let them rise until they're visibly puffy, 40 minutes to an hour. All right, let's uncover our ciabatta rolls, our ciabattina. Ooh, they're looking so good. So they definitely look visibly puffy. They've also expanded a little bit outwards, normal for these because it is such a soft dough. And we have a little bit of height too. Now in professional bread bakeries, they often use something called a steam injection oven. These are literally very fancy ovens that have an option to press a button and steam will be shot into the oven to create a humid, kind of moistened environment for the bread. And this really helps promote a crisp outer crust. If you've ever baked something like a baguette, a sourdough loaf at home, and you kind of wished that it was crustier, as crusty as you had in the bakery, it might be because you didn't add any steam. We're going to add steam in sort of the home way of putting a 9x13 pan full of ice cubes in the bottom of the oven as we bake. It uses about 1 to 2 quarts of ice cubes. I usually say about 6 cups if you can. If you don't have that much ice, just do what you can, or even some water will create some steam in the oven. I like to use a 9x13 pan so that when the ice is melted or when the water is really warm at the end of baking, it's still easy to get it in and out of the oven. Crusty things like the ciabatta and our crusty hoagie rolls really like being baked at hot, hot temperatures. We're gonna bake this at 450 degrees till they get a little bit visibly brown. We're also gonna see some of the flour on our baking sheet brown a little bit. That'll be another indicator. And we're gonna want to do that for about 18 to 22 minutes. I like to check the internal temperature of things like this to make sure that they're not just crispy on the outside and then we cut in and they're kind of gummy and underbaked inside. For these ciabattina, I like to get to a temperature of about 205 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of bake time. My crusty hoagie roll recipe uses a different type of pre-ferment that is, in this case, I'm just going to call it a pre-ferment, but it's gonna be a lot stiffer than the biga that we made for the ciabatta. It's a little bit more dough-like. And it's sort of essentially like mixing a small amount of the dough, letting it ferment for flavor, structure, all those things we already talked about, and then adding it to the dough so that that final dough benefits from everything. You could get away with this only sitting for 8 hours. You could get away with it sitting for up to 15. In my recipe, I say just to do it overnight. So this is like a little bread baking task you can do right before you tuck yourself into bed and dream of the sweet, crusty hoagie rolls you will be having the next day. The same rule applies for this pre-ferment. If your ambient room temperature is over 75 degrees Fahrenheit, do half of the time at room temperature and half of the time in the fridge so it doesn't go a little too far. So I've got a pre-ferment here that has been sitting for 12 hours. And as you can see, it's less liquid than the biga, a little bit more dough-like, still very soft, still some active bubbles on the surface. So the first thing I want to do is mix the dry ingredients a little bit to combine. I'm going to add them to the bowl of the stand mixer. We'll use a stand mixer with a dough hook for this recipe. I talk about this in the Understanding Yeast episode, but you can mix almost any bread that requires a mixer by hand, but some of them have longer knead times and really require a lot of structure. So the electric mixer is definitely your friend if you want to go from zero to dough a lot faster. Let's add our salt and also our instant yeast. Just give that a quick stir. You could also do this with your spatula just to combine those before we add the pre-ferment and the water. Let's add our pre-ferment. And yeah, when I start scraping it, you can definitely see how much stiffer than the biga it is because we could almost pour the biga into the bowl that we were working in. And this one, I have to do a little bit more of a scrapey scrape. And then we'll add our water. I'm gonna mix it on low speed for the dough to start to come together. We're gonna watch it go through that pickup stage where it'll start to pick up all of the different flour and really evenly start to hydrate. Then we'll raise the speed and we'll mix it to 2 minutes more at medium. Okay, this is one way that we know that this dough is done because it has fully completed the pickup stage. We see very little from around the bowl and we have kind of one uniform piece of dough. We can see that the dough itself is very smooth and it's ready to get a little bit of a rise. So what we're going to do is we're gonna put this into a lightly greased bowl where it has enough room to expand to almost double in size, and we're gonna let it sit for 2 hours, and then we'll give it a check. This crusty hoagie roll recipe is one that benefits from a little bit of pre-shaping. But it's not so much that this bread is high maintenance. This pre-shaping step is really to make it easier to do the final shaping for the person making the bread. So first we're going to divide the dough. I'm gonna put a little bit of flour on my scale, and you can just do this by eye. We want about 8 even pieces, but I just can't help it. I love my scale. The 8 even pieces should be about 190 grams each. In a lot of my recipes, I like to provide a gram reference weight like this. You can also weigh the dough and just then do the math to divide it evenly by 8 to decide what it's gonna be. And of course, if they're 5, 10 grams difference, it's not that big of a deal. But in the culinary world, they have a little phrase, if it looks the same, it cooks the same. And while in the baking world, I think this is a little more important actually. And we also don't cook, we bake. So we just wanna make sure that we don't have any that are so much larger that they're underbaked when some of the smaller ones are overly crisp. That's really why we're taking that extra bit of time to weigh it. But I definitely have some in here that are maybe closer to 200 instead of 190. That's okay. We just want to get it really, really as close as possible for the sake of them all being about the same size. Now, let's pre-shape these. Just going to go ahead and lightly flour part of my work surface. I'll first prick the dough a little bit with the tips of my fingers, sort of stippling the dough a little bit with my hands, and then I'm gonna start to bring some of the outside pieces in to sort of loosely form it into a little bit of a ball. When you're pre-shaping, we don't wanna go too crazy. We don't wanna make too much of a shape. We just wanna get it loosely where we want it to go. And in this case, I'm gonna go for a bit of a round shape, and you'll see why in a few minutes. So we don't wanna go too nuts. We wanna do this quickly. And we also don't wanna make the dough too tight or taut. Sort of as the more you shape dough, it will form a skin on the surface. And when we final shape the dough, we really want that skin there. But right now, we just wanna get ourselves started in the process. Once we get all of these pre-shaped, we'll cover them loosely right here on the work surface with a kitchen towel and just let it sit for 10 minutes. This is just to let the dough relax from the little bit of handling we just did. Again, all in the name of making it easier to get that baguette shape in the end. That's what we're gonna be making for these hoagie rolls, sort of a baton, just like a little baguette. Did you have a good cat nap? Oh, you look just as lovely as before. Now let's make you into the right shape. Because this dough has been resting, I would usually start with the very first one I did. And so I always kind of try to put them in an order where that's easy for me to remember. So this one right up top was our very first one. First thing we're going to do is I'm gonna turn it over so sort of the seam of what I was working with before is on top. This way we don't end up with that seam somehow working its way into our final shape. Again, the first motion is gonna be a little bit of a stippling motion with our fingers just to deflate the dough and also to start to flatten it a little bit. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start grabbing it from one end and pressing it down. I will keep doing this, just grabbing, pressing, pressing. And as you can see, I've already kind of started a very rough baguette sort of shape. When I get to the end, and it kind of right now it looks a little bit like a hot dog bun. When I get to the end of it, what I want to do is this sort of particular thing. We've showed it on Bake It Up a Notch before. I'm gonna use the thumb of my non-dominant hand and the heel of my dominant hand. And what I'm gonna do is the thumb is sort of going to fold the dough over onto itself one more time. And I'm gonna use the heel of my hand to press it down. This is what bakers do to make a really nice firm seal. Then what we wanna do is we want to start rolling the dough. I'm going to apply a little less pressure in the center and a little bit more on the outside. And that's going to naturally taper this to give it that sort of baguette shape. What I'm looking for is something about 8 inches in length, and I have my handy bench scraper here that's 6, so I can really use that to tell, ooh, this one's perfect. I've got 8 inches. So that is what I wanna do. Normally I would transfer this right to the baking sheet, but what I'm gonna do with this first one is set it aside so that I can use it as a reference for the ones I'm doing to follow. One thing that's important to remember with firmer doughs like this one is you really shouldn't need a lot of flour helping you shape it. In fact, using too much flour on your hands, the dough, or the work surface can actually make it a struggle to get this shape. The dough will sort of start resisting you instead of being manipulated the way you want it to. So I have flour all around, and I just sort of put a little on my hands when I need it, rather than directly on the dough or even on the surface where I'm working, because that's where it can start to be a little bit tricky. I put a little too much flour on this last one just to kind of show what the trouble is. And the main trouble is the seams don't want to stick to each other. And also when you start to roll it to get this oblong shape, it doesn't always want to roll. You have to physically move it because there's so much flour, it's not really sticking or grabbing the surface at all. Again, it's not impossible, but you just actually need, for many bread dough recipes like this one, a lot less flour than you may think. We'll cover the crusty hoagie rolls loosely for 40 minutes to 1 hour until we see that little bit of puffiness. Let's unveil our crusty hoagie rolls. Ah! They look so good. Oh my gosh. And because I want them to stay this beautiful shape that I've made them, this is one bread that will really benefit from scoring. Scoring is not only decorative and beautiful, but it also gives a spot for the steam to vent out on the loaf that's within your control. So by making a few lines on the surface of the bread will prevent the air from maybe bursting out the sides or creating kind of a wonky shaped roll. It will really help keep this more elongated shape that we worked so hard to create. So like kind of a baguette, I'm gonna do 3 diagonal slashes. I am using just a razor blade to do this. Please be very careful if you're using that tool. You can also use a sharp knife. You can also snip it with some scissors, sharp kitchen shears, and of course you can use the actual tool that then delicately holds this razor blade, which is known as a lame. Now, these rolls also benefit from being baked with some steam. So just like the ciabatta, we are gonna put a 9x13 tray of ice cubes in the oven with the rolls as they bake. We are also going to have an optional sort of step here where you can spritz a little water on the surface. You can do this with a spray bottle, or you can even just grab kind of a handful of water and kind of flick some over the surface of these. That's just gonna moisten the surface, and that's going to help create some steam when we get to the oven. This is gonna help us with a magical process of bread baking that's known as oven spring. This is kind of the moment right when it goes into the hot oven where the bread jumps up a little bit and it does a little final kind of rise under the heat of the oven. And then it starts to set and form its final crust and shape. Another thing you can do to help encourage a nice golden brown crust and an intense oven spring is to bake the pan on top of a baking steel or pizza stone. That just gives a little bit of that extra retained heat in the oven. It's going to really help encourage things to behave the way you want them to. In the recipe, I instruct you to bake 1 pan at a time, because if you've got that 9x13 pan of ice in there, you really only have typically kind of the 2 shelves to go. Of course, here in the Food 52 test kitchen, we have lots of ovens, so I'm going to bake these both at the same time, but just follow those instructions in the recipe for baking in batches if you need to. The first 2 doughs we made are lean doughs, which means they're basically just made with flour, salt, yeast, and water. But this is considered an enriched dough. Enriching ingredients are things like milk, sugar, eggs, butter, anything that's going to kind of make this a softer dough, a very golden brown dough, a fluffy dough. And when I created this recipe, I was sort of trying to picture a sandwich roll that had the light, fluffy butteriness of a Parker House roll, but in more of a sandwich bun size, and it really, really delivers. So the first thing I'm going to do is in the bowl of my stand mixer, it's fitted with the hook attachment. I'm gonna pour my warm water in the base of the mixer first, and I'm going to sprinkle my yeast over it and just let that sit for a few minutes while we do some other things to help kind of get it started dissolving in this process. We don't even need to mix it, just let it kind of sit, hang out there for a second. Next, we're gonna warm up our milk. We just want it to feel just barely warm to the touch, so it doesn't take that long to get it there. And we'll also take that as an opportunity to melt our butter. So our yeast has had a minute to sit in the warm water. We've warmed up our milk and our butter. Now let's go ahead and add all the dry ingredients into the mixer. Our very happy flour. This recipe also includes one of my favorite ingredients for enriched breads, which is dry milk. Dry milk allows you to gain some of the additional perks of using milk without having to necessarily add more liquid. So we're gonna get a little bit more browning on these rolls. We're gonna get a little bit more tender inside without having to mess with a hydration that would make this dough too sticky to easily handle. We've also got a little bit of sugar and of course salt. Now, sometimes people think, why are you adding sugar to a bread recipe that I might use for sandwich rolls? But sugar really plays an important role in a lot of baked goods, especially breads, that you don't necessarily think of. Yes, it's going to add a little bit of sweetness. Love that, that's lovely. But really what it does is actually extends the shelf life. It's actually going to make these rolls go stale a little bit less quickly. And on top of it, it's also going to keep the insides really soft and fluffy. So while not all bread doughs need sugar in them, when it uses just a little small amount, yes, you can leave it out if you're trying to watch your sugar intake, but know that it's going to affect more than just the flavor of the rolls. It's also going to affect the final texture. Let's give that a little stir just to combine everything with the yeast down below. Okay, great. Now we're gonna add our other ingredients. I've got a little bit of honey, both for flavor and contributes some of those additional kind of sugar attributions. And this is what's gonna keep this a little bit more in that like delicious, enriched sort of Parker House world. We're also gonna add a couple of eggs. And then we'll add our warm milk and butter as well. We're gonna mix on low speed for 4 minutes until a soft, shaggy dough starts to form. We've mixed for the first 4 minutes. The dough is looking pretty smooth. You'll also notice it's a very soft dough. Again, it's very heavily enriched. What I wanna do before I raise the speed is just give it a really good scrape, and this is why. This happens a lot in bread baking. Look at that. There was a bunch down at the bottom. So we gotta get all that back in there. Then we'll raise the speed to medium and we'll mix it for 3 minutes more until the dough is very, very uniform and smooth. Still looks like a soft dough, but we also can see that it's really smooth, uniform in color, uniform in texture. So let's transfer it to a bowl for its rise time. I like to transfer it to a lightly greased bowl because again, this is a very sticky dough. And I'll use slightly damp hands to help me just make it into a little round inside the bowl. And bonus points if you have a bowl that's as beautiful as this one and matches your outfit. Let's give this a cover and we're gonna let it rise for 45 minutes to an hour until it has gotten very puffy, almost double in size. The steps of folding are normally more for lean doughs, again, so they can develop some of that structure, some of that strength. But this soft, fluffy bun recipe is so highly enriched that it actually benefits from gaining a little bit of structure as well. Instead of folding it inside the bowl, I actually like to turn it out onto the work surface. It just makes it a little bit easier. But to do that, we need to flour our work surface a bit just to prevent it from sticking. So a nice all over dusting. I'll even give the dough a little bit of a dusting on the top before I turn it out. Ooh, look how soft that is. Oh, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. All right, let's fold it. I wanna fold it onto itself a couple of times. I'm not flouring the surface of it because I don't need any flour really getting incorporated into the interior of the dough. So just stretch it out and bring it through. Grab it and bring it over. Grab it, bring it over. Let's rotate it, grab it, bring it over. That's looking perfect. Give it a little bit of rounding and back in the bowl it's gonna go. That was fun. It's going to rise for 30 to 40 minutes more until it looks puffy up towards the top of the bowl again. Does it look good? Woo, 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 woo. Let's shape our soft, fluffy rolls. I'm so excited for these. Look how beautifully this has doubled in size, really behaving exactly as we want. I'm gonna turn the dough out onto a lightly floured surface to divide it. We wanna divide this recipe into 12 even pieces, which will be about 95 grams each if you're wanting to weigh it. I'm just gonna move some of my dough pieces aside so you all can see how I'm gonna shape these. But we talked about this actually in our dinner rolls recipe of Bake It Up a Notch. We're just gonna make them into little rounds, using only as much flour as you need to prevent the dough from sticking. Kind of first, just form it into a rough round, and then I wanna be using the heel of my hand here, and especially the thumb, to help do the tightening. And as I round them, they'll form this nice taut kind of skin on the surface. I'll just transfer them to my baking sheet. You can bake these on one single baking sheet, parchment lined, and all the rolls will kind of grow together during proofing and baking, and it works great. Or you can divide them between 2 sheet trays, both lined with parchment, and that works wonderfully too. I'm going to cover these either with a clean kitchen towel or with an enriched dough like this. Sometimes I like to use greased plastic wrap. That way it just makes sure that as this dough rises, because it is very sticky, that it's not going to get stuck on there and will ruin the perfect surface of these rolls. They're going to rise until they're visibly puffy, 30 minutes to an hour depending on how warm it is, and then we'll give them an egg wash so that they can get extra golden brown when we bake them. These are looking great, our soft, fluffy buns. To help these buns brown uniformly in the oven, I like to add a layer of egg wash. This would also be a time if you wanted to add any kind of toppings like flaky sea salt or sesame seeds. That would be great, and the egg wash would help them stick. One of the most important things about enriched doughs is that they are typically baked at a lower temperature because, again, they have all these things in them that are already kind of naturally prone to browning, things like eggs or sugar or butter. So what we want to do is we want to bake them at 350 degrees. We do want them to get really nice and deeply golden brown. It's going to take about 22 to 25 minutes. And we don't want to overbake these because they can actually start to lose some of that softness. So I'm looking for an internal temperature closer to 200 degrees Fahrenheit for these if you want to use my thermometer test. We're going to bake these both at the same time, and about halfway through baking, I'll switch the pan's placement in the oven. But if you are baking them all on one baking sheet, like I talked about earlier, you can just bake them on the middle rack, and you never have to rotate them unless, your oven needs that little bit of extra help. That's one of those things. If you're wondering how you can learn more to know your oven, you're gonna wanna check out our Knowing Your Oven episode of Bake It Up a Notch. You can really learn a lot about that oven that you do all your baking in, no matter what brand it is, no matter what type it is. While the kitchen here at Food 52 is filled with the smells of freshly baking bread, it's time for a brand new segment called Kneading Answers, with a K. Is it better to macerate berries and other fruit in the fridge before baking? I think pie tastes better saucy, and I do this for my apples too. I define a good slice of pie by its sliceability. So I typically don't like it to be too saucy or too runny. But if you do, you're probably just going to like pie fillings made from raw fruit. You can macerate them or not. Macerating is going to cause the fruit to break down a little bit more even before baking. So your final pie might be a little bit softer and a little bit saucier as a result. Personally, I love pre-cooking my filling, and I use that maceration as part of the pre-cooking to make sure that I get a beautiful slice every time. Here's a comment that asks why I have a tilt head stand mixer. So I have a variety of different pieces of equipment at my house, but since I'm largely developing recipes for people at home, I like to try to make sure that I'm using what the typical person might have at home. Now, the bowl crank or bowl lift stand mixers are typically slightly larger in size. They have a bigger capacity. So I have a few tilt head mixers that I'm often using because I'm developing recipes for that size of bowl. But both work great, and as a professional, I definitely love that bowl lift because it lets you get in to scrape a little bit easier. You're not messing with that tilt head back and forth. The more you use a tilt head mixer, the more likely it is that the force of whatever you're mixing is going to loosen that top of the tilt head a little bit. The bolts are kind of on the side where the tilt head meets the stand, and you can just tighten them yourself at home anytime it starts to feel a little loose or jiggly. Can I use your brioche recipe for cinnamon buns? Yes, brioche makes a very delicious and decadent cinnamon bun. I've actually had a cinnamon roll recipe on Food 52 for years and years and years that uses a dough extremely similar to brioche as the base. So go check that out. Everybody loves it. You can see it in the comments. So we made some fantastic rolls in this episode, but I cannot let this episode go by without talking about these, my pretzel rolls. And I'm not gonna make them in this episode because we already have a whole episode on soft pretzels, and of course we talk about these pretzel rolls. I love them for burgers, egg sandwiches, and today I think I'm gonna do sort of like a roast beef and cheese with them. But really any kind of sandwich that you can think of, this pretzel roll is where it's at, and be sure that you don't miss that soft pretzel episode. It is delicious. Thank you so much for joining me for this especially delicious smelling episode of Bake It Up a Notch, where I dove deep into all things sandwich, rolls, and buns. You can see all of our delicious buns in front of me, and I picked a few sandwiches to make on some of these buns just to also show you what I would make with it. On the Ciabatta Rolls, I've made kind of a version of my mom's salmon sandwich, which is basically like a BLT, but with a marinated salmon fillet tucked in there as well. We also just have a regular BLT. On our pretzel buns, I have a roast beef and cheese sandwich, all melty, all gooey. On our crusty hoagie rolls, we made some meatball subs. This is actually one of my recipes from Food 52. And then we put a little shrimp salad on top of the fluffy buns, and those are gonna be so good. As always, all of the recipes are linked in the video description below, so you can head down there to snag them, or you can head to food52.com. And I think I'm gonna dive into some of these rolls. I really want you to hear how crunchy this sounds. Did you hear that? Yeah. If this episode gets you excited to make your own sandwiches, please use hashtag #BakeItUpANotch or leave us a comment and let us know what you're making. And if you're excited and want to learn even more, I want to recommend you go back to one of our old episodes of Bake It Up a Notch. It was one of the very first ones. It's called Understanding Yeast, and it does a ton to demystify the whole process for you. So as always, until next time, happy baking and happy eating. Do you hear the crunch?